But what I don't want to be confused about is about the power or the crucial role that emotion plays in human decision making and human choice and human action. Simply because even if you go to the behavioral science that is the most calculative, emotionless in its analysis of human behavior, namely economics, what you find is that economics finds it perfectly allowable for emotions to enter into the types of decisions that people have to calculate. So for example, let's imagine that you're deciding whether or not to buy risky stock A and call your broker up. There are a number of calculations that factor into that decision, and it's perfectly allowable in economics to think about and to add into your utility function the happiness you would feel if the stock rises and the disappointment you would feel if the stock drops. Perfectly allowable to put that in. Or if you're considering risky stock versus safe stock, it's perfectly allowable to consider at the time of your decision the potential regret you might feel if you choose risky stock and it drops when you could have had safe stock and could have gotten some money or obtained some money through more secure means. That is, emotion is perfectly allowable as something to consider at the time you are making a decision. Now, what I want to talk about today, however, and how this relates to the idea of mixed emotions, is if you take a look at theorizing in economics, and a lot of theorizing in psychology, and a lot of theorizing in psychology is quasi-economic, what you see is that emotions are allowed into the decision, but only at one layer. And that's at this layer that happens at potential outcome. That is, you're allowed to think about what emotions you might feel when the transaction is done and the history is written. These are emotions that you anticipate. You're allowed to think of these emotions, but that's what you're thinking about. You're projecting to your future self how your future self feel, and as a consequence using those potential future selves as input into your decision now. And what I want to suggest today is that if you take a look at psychology and other social sciences, you realize that there is another potential layer of emotion that can enter into a decision that often I would submit gets overlooked, and that's that these anticipated emotions about how you project you would feel in the future, but rather emotions that you're feeling here and now about the specific decisions that you're considering. These are emotions that you attach to the action of either choosing risky stock A or staying with or choosing safe stock B. I'm going to call these immediate emotions because that's what they're called. It's a horrible term, but such as it is. And what our work has been doing in part in my lab for the past few years is asking whether or not there is a story to be told about immediate emotions, as well as voluminous economic and psychological work on anticipated emotions. To what extent do immediate emotions have an impact on people's decisions that's independent of anticipated emotions, and how powerful is that impact? Let me just make sure everybody knows that by just repeating that. Namely, I want to ask, do immediate emotions matter? And I also want to ask how much does their impact or role or correlation matter relative to the emotions that everybody talks about, namely anticipated emotions. Now, let me make one thing perfectly clear before we start off on the empirical part of the journey. By immediate emotions, I'm not talking about the way psychologists tend to think about emotions or play with emotions, which is I make you feel happy or sad or anxious or not, and then see what happens to your decision. That is, I play with your emotion and see how that has an impact on your decision. That's what I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about confronting you with a decision and then seeing what emotions are elicited from the confrontation of the decision. This is not the impact of emotions on decision. This is the impact of having the decision. How does it impact your emotions? And does it matter how much do potential feelings that people attach to the decision options, the actions they have in front of them, how much does that matter relative to the outcomes that they have in front of them? Well, let me give you two examples of the type of research you can do asking this question. You can see you can have mixed emotions. You can have a set of emotions roiling at the immediate level that can have quite a different profile from emotions that are roiling at the anticipated level. And in one of the simple studies we did, by the way, these are studies that I did with my German collaborators. That phrase always sounds funny. At the University of Cologne, Detlef Fetchenhauer and Thomas Schlesser. Thomas Schlesser is actually the lead author in a lot of this work. What we do is we present people with the simplest economic decision that you can give them, which is essentially, will you bet $5 on the flip of a coin with the chance to win 10? That's it, double or nothing. And we present them with the choice and then ask them how they would feel about that choice. Now, in 6 different ways. 2 of them have to do with their immediate emotions. How do they feel when they contemplate flipping that coin and taking the gamble? How do they feel about playing it safe? So we ask about their immediate emotions attached to the various decision options they have. And then we ask them about how they would feel about the 4 different outcomes they might face at the end of the experiment. They flipped the coin, they won; they flipped the coin, they lost; or they played it safe and they found out they would have won or they would have lost. We want to simply see what's the impact or the role or what's the predictive value of each of those emotional profiles in predicting what people do. Now, because we're asking people 6 times to talk about their emotions, we have to simplify things. We have to ask questions, a small set of questions that are the same for each of the 6 different scenarios we're asking people to talk about. So what we present them with is and I'm sure everybody in the room knows this, the self-assessment mannequin, where we ask them about, like, how do you feel about flipping the coin? And they can rate it in terms of, that action in terms of its positivity, how aroused it makes them feel, and how in control they feel about if they chose that decision. That's obviously EPA for those of you who know the ancient past, well, relatively ancient past of psychology. But we ask basically people to rate each of the 6 scenarios that are relevant to flipping a coin. And that allows us to get data like this. We asked them to do the ratings. And then we do a cluster analysis because people tend to cluster to nice, neat groups based on how they rate the various options. So for example, when we ask people how they would feel about keeping the coin, or keeping the $5 and not flipping, we have a red group that feels rather positive, somewhat calm, and very much in control about keeping the coin. We have a blue group that's neutral about keeping the coin, very calm and somewhat less in control. It turns out at the end, if you take a look at what percentage of people actually flip the coin based on these 2 clusters, what cluster they fall into, the red group is only 24% of the people in the red group are likely to flip the coin. 66% of the people who really just aren't excited about keeping the coin decide to flip the coin. That is, how people feel about keeping the coin does predict who flips, and how they feel about flipping does predict who flips the coin. Namely, you could have a blue group that is calm, it's neutral about flipping the coin, not very anxious about it, and not very in control, versus a red group, which is rather positive about flipping the coin, and aroused, excited about flipping the coin, and feels very much in control. Well, 57% of this red group flips the coin. Only about 17% of the people who fall in the blue group flip the coin. That is, if you take a look at the emotional profiles that you get by studying immediate emotions, what emotions or feelings people attach to the actions that they're considering, well, you can very much predict who's going to flip the coin and who's not going to flip the coin. And here's the kicker. I'm not showing you what happens at the anticipated emotions level because it doesn't predict much at all in terms of who's going to flip the coin. That is, if you look at the variance explained by immediate emotions, the way we've measured it, versus the variance explained by the anticipated emotions, how people feel about the various outcomes of winning or losing, this is variance explained by each of those types of emotions. This is unique variance explained. What you basically find is that immediate emotions are a significant predictor of what decision people make. What about emotions attached to the outcome? At best, they're marginally significant predictor. They're not really in the mix whatsoever. That is, the emotions that economists and many psychologists tend to think about. Now, that's one type of experiment you can do, asking about what exactly is the type of emotion and what is it attached to that may have an impact on people's decisions. You can also use it to try to answer some questions that lie at the heart of economics and lie at the heart of psychology. One question is people have to often act in the face of risk. They have to gamble or not. And the question, one major question, has always been, does the source of the risk matter? Namely, if you're betting on the flip of a coin, that's one source of risk, that's nature. But what if you're betting on the decision of another person? That's potentially a different type of risk. That's a social risk. That's betting on the whether or not another person is going to be magnanimous and generous, or are they going to be stingy. Well, if you equate the two decisions economically, are they the same in terms of their payoffs and in terms of probability of their payoffs, or do people treat those two risks rather differently? Well, flipping a coin is a risk against nature. What might be a risk, again, a social risk that you might take? Well, let me give you one that we can have students do in the laboratory, and we and dozens of other researchers present students or other people with this social risk. Let's imagine that I bring you into a room with a large number of people in it, and I give you $5. Shoot, I forgot the $5 today, I apologize. But let's imagine that I told you, you're player one, and I've told you that I've assigned to you another person in the room. You just don't know who it is, and they won't know who you are. You're going to do this in mutual anonymity. But here's what you can do with the $5. You can either keep it, in which case you have $5 and the other person has nothing, or you can give that $5 to player number two, and they then have a choice. They can either, and by the way, if you give the money to player number two, $5 magically becomes 20. And they can either keep the entire 20, or they can give you $10 back. Now the question is this: do you give up the $5 because you might get $10 back? But then again, your trust, and this is known as the trust game, might be violated, and the other person may just keep everything, may keep the $20. Well, excuse me, let's take a look where we compare how people respond to this risky situation to one in which people can take a risk but against nature, if you will. So we can present people with this trust game that I've just outlined. You can give your $5 for another person. Or you can bet your $5 on a flip of a coin, potentially to win 10. That's the first situation I showed you. Now, those two situations differ in terms of being a social risk and a non-social risk. They also differ according to whether or not there's another person who might receive an outcome. So we have to create a third situation where it's I keep wanting to say crime against nature. No, it's a gamble against nature, where you can, not only you can win, but another person can potentially win as well. That is, if you win $10, some other person in the room, you don't know who wins $10. If you lose, you get nothing, but congratulations, some other person in the room gets $20. So essentially it has the same payoff structure as the trust game, except now you're betting against nature. And the question is, how are people going to deal with those risks, particularly with the types of emotions that they arouse? Here's where mixed emotions come in. Here's where you start to have a competition between what's happening at the anticipated level versus the immediate level. Now, here we're going to ask people pointed adjectives about how they're feeling, because here we're being guided by theory. And essentially, if you ask people about their anticipated emotions, how do they feel about risking or not, then finding out what the other person would do, either return the money or not, essentially what you get is a story of betrayal. That is, if you take a look at how people respond to the idea of, let's say, risking the money and then having the other person keep the money, violating their trust, what you find is they would feel much more betrayed and angry than they would if it were just merely a coin flip. After all, how can a coin betray you? Another person can betray you, but a coin flip can't. In fact, even if people keep the money and the other person decides that they would never have given you money back, people still feel more betrayed and angry than they would in the coin flip situation. That is, there is an issue of betrayal that arises with the trust game. And if you take a look at the economic literature as we stand today, what the economic literature predicts is that this will cause people not to take risks with other people, even though they would take those risks with nature. That people are adverse to social risks because they're averse to betrayal. That's the story coming out of economics, and that's the story that you get at the anticipated level. There's an added negative kick to trusting another person that you don't have with a coin. A coin can't show you to be the chump, for example. That's at the anticipated level. What about the immediate level? What you get is a very interesting story, but it's a very different story in terms of whether you're talking about coins or people. These last two bars here, this is keeping the money, this is risking the money. Last two bars here are about coin flips, and this is about how much tension, anxiety, guilt, and remorse you report when you're contemplating either keeping the money or flipping the coin. And if you take a look at the coin situations, what you find is people feel significantly more anxious and tense about flipping the coin than they do about keeping the money. If there's an aversive reaction people have that causes a lot of people not to flip the coin, it's an anxiety story. But here's the trick for the trust game. Note that trusting another person also causes anxiety, but it causes even more anxiety if you decide to play it safe and keep the money. And the which option becomes more anxious and tense actually flips between flipping a coin and trusting another person. Now, why is that? Let me summarize 12 years of work in one sentence. It's because keeping the money is to insult the other person, and people feel very tense about insulting the other person. Without any information that they're a bad person, they feel they have to respect the character of the other individual. That causes the anxiety profile to flip. Now, if you take a look at this would suggest that people might be more likely to take a social risk than a non-social risk because they want to avoid the anxiety associated with keeping the money. So you have a betrayal story coming out of economics. You have an anxiety story coming out of, let's say, psychology. Which one wins? Well, I'm not acting apologetic, so I might as well show. It turns out that if you take a look at what people do in these two situations, for both coin flips, people do not like to gamble. In fact, they don't like to gamble against nature at all. But they do like to trust other people, even at the same level of expectation that they would get reward back. These people think there's only a 50% chance of getting a reward, much like these individuals. But now the number of people willing to take a gamble on another person, take a social risk, is at 2/3 as opposed to 1/3. Then you wouldn't necessarily know this unless you were measuring emotions at the immediate level versus staying at the anticipated level. And once again, if you take a look at how much variance is being explained by emotions that attach to the decision, as opposed to the outcome, what you find are the emotions that attach to the decision win in terms of how much variance they're explaining. In fact, anticipated emotions really don't explain much variance at all in terms of how in terms of what risks people take in the situations that I've said here. Now, this leads me to quickly go through these conclusions quickly because I'm sure there are going to be questions. The first is that measuring emotions at the immediate level matter, and I think they matter even though the immediate level is the level or the layer I think has been given short shrift in terms of thinking, especially thinking that's quasi or purely economic. For those who are in the know, the real headline of this talk is that what I'm really saying is that people regulate themselves, but they're regulated in terms of the actions they pursue rather than the outcomes they pursue. A lot of what I'm talking about here is outcomes don't enter into the mix as much as you think, if at all. People are regulating in terms of which action they wish to choose, and that's where they're myopic in terms of staying on that. One could think about older adults who, according to many researchers, regulate more in terms of emotional satisfaction. Was that regulation happening at the level of action or outcome? That's an interesting question. And finally, I give you the case of trust, which we just talked about, because all of the conclusions that I've just mentioned, taking a social risk on the potential beneficence of another person brings these themes to the fore in a very, very stark and a bare way. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions that people might have.